One of the topics that has dominated our pages and our discourse over the last several years really is mobile technology, and across multiple sectors and multiple industries. And it's been a hot topic for the site for several years now, and for good reason. According to the International Telecommunications Union, the number of worldwide mobile subscriptions now exceeds the world population, so 7.1 billion roughly, thereabouts. That's up incidentally from 6 billion in 2011 and 5.4 billion in 2010. As a planet, we're going to reach 1.4 billion smartphone subscriptions, or users, I should say, by the end of the year, which means basically one smartphone for every 5 people. Obviously, those aren't distributed equitably around the world necessarily, but it shows how quickly the technology is growing and changing. But cell phones are really only the tip of the spear when it comes to digital data. Behind them is data for billions of people that's painting a really complex picture and constantly changing in terms of how we live our lives, how we consume products, how we participate or we don't participate in the financial system, how we care for our family's health, how we make a living. And we've seen an explosion in business models and development agencies, multinationals, all working to try to harness the power of this data for good, for profit, and for social impact. So the terms big data and mobile money, these are still relatively new, but we're already at something like 190 mobile platforms worldwide. Most of them aren't profitable, except for M-Pesa, perhaps. But there's a lot more in the pipeline. And it's no longer just about sending money home safely and liquidity at ATMs and at convenience stores. We're seeing huge cross-pollination between financial, health, different types of lending and insurance. And basically any service is trying to get in there through mobile. Just a couple of examples that we've had on our pages on NextBillion in the last couple of months. In Ghana, one of the country's largest mobile network operators, Tigo Cash, is working with Gadco, which is a major rice supplier, and Miller. And they're teaming up to manage transactions and payments to farmers, reducing the theft and increasing, that goes with cash rather. In Haiti, a mobile money platform called Haiti Pay is helping customers keep their money not just in the bank, but in accounts for schools, for healthcare, for insurance, for different types of purchases. And as a result, it's creating a network of community-based networks that revolve around small ecosystems and small providers and businesses. In South Africa, the Mobile Alliance for Maternal Action, affectionately known as MAMA, is using mobile technology to improve the lives and the health of expectant mothers and recent mothers, new mothers, with information about infant care, nutrition, developmental milestones they should be watching out for their children, through social networking, through their cell phones, and through voicemails. So these are all great examples and about big tech or big data and mobile tech. And I'm sure our panelists, as well as those of you in the audience, probably have dozens more examples that you could bring, and hopefully we'll get into a lot of those as we talk through it. And there's no doubt that mobile technology for the base of the pyramid is enabling new business models and building real and lasting, or the question is though, is it building real and lasting impact? How much of this is hype? That's the other thing we need to cover in this panel. How much of it is compelling storytelling without a ton of impact? And there's questions that are dogging the big data and mobile technologies, real world issues that are less sexy but nonetheless important. The pipelines, the network limitations, the electricity scarcity, the regulatory confusion that it brings, and just plain old turf battles that are cropping up. A few weeks ago, this is sort of tangential to the conversation, but I think it's useful. A few weeks ago, Bill Gates was asked about the Google Loon project. Does anyone know about what Google Loon is? It's basically an experiment that Google has in they're launching weather balloons, basically, to provide wireless internet over certain regions. And Gates was asked about this, and he said, when you're dying of malaria, I suppose you'll look up and see that balloon, and I'm not sure how it will help you. So obviously, you'd be hard-pressed to get Bill Gates to say anything nice about Google. But he does raise a good point. I mean, here's the premier development investor in the world who's a little circumspect about that sort of an application. So we're going to do some reality checking too in this panel, I hope. And just before we move on to introduce our panelists, I just want to get a sort of a sense of the room, and we'll take a poll here. Show of hands, how many of you believe that mobile technology plus big data equals significant progress in poverty alleviation? So we get, looks like kind of like about a third of the room. And how many of you would say, that's mostly hype? Okay, well, maybe we'll make believers out of some and non-believers out of others when we get through it. So SEC has put together a really strong panel here that we have leaders from companies that are using mobile technologies and harnessing big data within specific sectors. And we also have representatives from the investment community and people and a research community who have a little bit of a broader view about what's happening. So let me just introduce the panel real quick, and I'm going to ask each of them to take a couple of minutes and tell us their perspective. Shivani Soroya is the CEO and founder of Inventure. Shivani. Keith Nalipka is the Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing for PharmaSecure. Alina Kogan is the Investment Officer at Axion Venture Lab. And my pal Camilo Teliz leads the Brazilian Technology and Business Model Innovation team at the Consultive Group to assist the poor, or CGAP. So let me dig a little deeper in these bios, and I'll introduce each person again. And Shivani is CEO and founder of Inventure, which uses mobile data and financial management as a way of helping poor people build financial identities. Inventure is developing a standardized credit scoring system for the unbanked and to help them qualify for financing, which is something that 2.7 billion people in the world are without. Inventure also provides education, financial metrics, and partnerships to improve the low-income financial industry, service industry, I should say. Before starting Inventure, Shivani worked in health costing at the United Nations Population Fund and in mergers and acquisitions at the HealthNet and Citigroup. She is an Ashoka 2013 fellow, a couple more fellows there, a 2013 TED fellow, an Echo and Green fellow, and an Unreasonable Institute fellow. So plenty of fellowships there. So Shivani, why don't you give us a minute or two to tell us a little bit about Inventure and about how you're harnessing the data.
Sure. So what we... Oh, Stan. So what we're doing at Inventure is we build really simple mobile tools that work over text messaging, voice, and web, and allow people to do all of their basic money management, savings, and demonstrate their creditworthiness all through a simple feature phone. So we take all this cash flow data that we're generating, income, expense data, plus demographic information that we collect on them, and we actually turn all of that into a financial identity or a credit score. And then we pass that on to the other side of the marketplace, to service companies, product companies, and financial institutions to get them to understand that there's this entire demographic of individuals who actually can afford their services and can qualify for products and services that they want.
Great, thank you. We're going to ping pong around a little bit, and I would like to also introduce Keith Nalipka. Keith is, again, the Vice President of Global Sales and Marketing for PharmaSecure, a technology company that's enabling base-of-the-pyramid patients to use their mobile phones to validate prescription drugs and to avoid counterfeit medications. Keith just recently joined the team on the patient engagement side of PharmaSecure, which is aiming to help customers measure and understand patient behavior as they secure the distribution of their pharmaceutical products. He spent several years playing professional ball for the Texas Rangers. Sorry about the playoffs. And after spending several years playing baseball, he jumped into the biotech pharmaceutical industry. He's worked for 12 years in sales and marketing for billion-dollar cardiovascular, respiratory, and pain management brands. So Keith, could you give us a quick overview about what PharmaSecure does?
Yeah, sure. So PharmaSecure was founded in India by Nathan Sigworth, and every second we secure the medicine of 20 patients. To date, we have a mobile platform that engages patients through an SMS-based platform, smartphone, most cases it's SMS. We also can engage them through the internet. But to date, we've engaged about 700 million patients, collected large subsets of data, and we're really at the point of as this panel is discussing, who cares? What are we going to do with this data? We've collected it. We've got data that is really rich in that sense, but we're really at an inflection point in dealing with a lot of these organizations that, who cares? You have all this data, what does it look like? How can we commoditize it? And how can we take it forward to either change patient behavior, drive health outcomes, or work with NGOs to secure that the money that they're spending is getting directly to patients' mouths. The injections are getting put in patients' arm. The platform also authenticates medicine, so we work with all manufacturers to essentially put an SMS code on the back of prescription drugs. The patient gets it, texts us the code back, so we prevent and authenticate that the medicine came from that manufacturer and it's authentic. So that's the basis of the platform. But we're really at an inflection point when I came into the company of saying, just as this, who cares? We have all this data. How rich is it? What can you do with it? And that's really the essence of we are as a company, is trying to commoditize it and try to drive health outcomes. We have a great platform, but again, you can write the best code, extract the best data, but who really wants to see it? How do they want to see it? How you can give it to them is really the essence of what we do. So.
Thanks, Keith. We care. We want to know about
Good.
it.
Thanks, Scott. We'll sell it to you then.
I should mention that we're going to take questions too, so you can tweet them to the hashtag SECONF Big Data. So that's SECONF Big Data, and we'll be asking those as we go. Alina, as I mentioned, is the investment officer at Axion Venture Lab. She leads their Latin American work. Venture Lab is an investment initiative of Axion International, and it provides seed capital and support to innovative financial inclusion startups. It seeks to foster experimentation to promote business models that improve financial access for people living in poverty worldwide. She began her career as a social entrepreneur, founding a school in Afghanistan, which we're going to have to talk about at some point, and leading grassroots efforts to development efforts in Mexico and Brazil. She was also a strategy consultant at Dahlberg, and she helped the IFC launch the SME Ventures funds in frontier markets. So, Alina, if you could give us a couple words on what the lab is doing, what you're cooking up there.
Sure. So, as Scott mentioned, we support early-stage entrepreneurs, and I just wanted to start by giving a few examples of really exciting companies out there that are using different types of data to extend access to credit, which is kind of a big part of financial inclusion space that we focus on. So one company in our portfolio is called Demist Data, and it's a big data analytics company actually based most recently here in New York. And they help large financial institutions analyze hundreds of public, usually messy data sources to extend credits to what's called thin file customers. So customers who would otherwise be rejected because they don't have enough information in credit bureaus, but thanks to the work of this company and their very sophisticated algorithms and machine learning techniques, they're able to help these financial institutions approve about 20% of customers who would otherwise be rejected for credit. This is one example of using public sources of data. There's another company that we are looking at in Tanzania, actually started by a recent SIPA alum. It's called First Access. And they use data from mobile network operators, again, on customers that don't have much information, and definitely not from credit bureaus in Tanzania, to produce credit scoring and sell that to microfinance institutions to further extend access to credit. And as the third example I'll mention, it's a company, there are actually several companies, one Trefi in Peru, another called Go Finance in Tanzania. These help SMEs get access to credit by analyzing data from their suppliers. So as they bring together the data from the consumer goods companies, whether it's Coca-Cola's or beer companies and others who are constantly providing goods, they analyze that data and are able to kind of see their inventory management, their cash management, and use that data to extend access to credit. So there are various sources. Some may be defined as big data, some may be small data, but of ways to bring it to bear to social impact.
Thank you, Alina. Also, finally, Camilo, before joining CGAP, or I should say your research area focuses on the use of digital payments infrastructure in sectors such as energy, water, and health, so well beyond just the mobile money space. Before joining CGAP, you were also an analyst for mobile money for the Unbanked program at GSM in London, and there you supported mobile network operators in Latin America. And Camilo's also worked at the UN Economic Commission for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok and at Microsoft Labs in Bangalore, where he conducted ICT research. Camilo, if you could give us the overview from not only Brazil, but from what else you're seeing at CGAP.
Well, CGAP is a multi-donor trust fund. It's housed at the World Bank, and its focus traditionally has been on microfinance. Throughout the years, it's moved on to financial inclusion, and we've been looking very closely at the development of mobile money as a tool for financial inclusion. We actually advised DFID when they gave the initial grant to Vodafone to start M-Pesa. So throughout the years, we've sort of kind of seen the evolution of the industry. Nowadays, since a lot of the research has been focused on operational issues, actually mobile money is everywhere, but people were not using it. So a lot of the focus was on that. And now we're starting to look at sort of kind of the next generation of products and services that could be delivered over mobile money. So specifically looking at health, agriculture, energy, water. So that's what we're up to nowadays.
Great. Well, I thought we'd get into it a little bit deeper, and Keith, turning to you from the PharmaSecure perspective. So we know something like 20% of drugs on the market in say, I think it's in India rather, they're fake, right? So,
Yes.
so that's a big challenge.
It is a huge challenge.
And that, I mean, I know we want to get into how this eventually helps the patients and the customers and how you're able to dig into that data. But what have you found in terms of your impact so far in using mobile technologies to root out and working with pharmaceutical companies to root out that counterfeit data?
The programs are very effective. And you mentioned India. Nigeria is the same way. Nigeria, the counterfeit rate is about 60%. So those rates are much higher, and the impact of those are lethal. The impact of the failure to authenticate medicines is really lethal. Patients going in thinking they're getting vaccinated against malaria or things like that, and they end up getting the counterfeit medicine, and again, the end result is death. So we've been really effective. We have now the largest TB registry in India, about 25,000 patients, and we converted a patient program there that was called DOTS, where patients were having to go into a health clinic, have a practitioner hand them a medicine, sign off that they took the medicine, and then come back daily to do that. We've put that program on our mobile platform and really have dramatically affected TB rates and also affected, again, the amount of health outcomes, which is really, for us, it's getting to the data, creating more rich data. It's not just our platform where we're authenticating medicines. That is really, stops at a certain point. And again, what can we do with that? You can't drive health outcomes with that. So we had to get to a more patient level. We had to get to a more health outcome level to really have an impact on health outcomes and long-term success and survival of patients.
And Shivani, I guess a similar question for you is you've amassed a lot of data, and give us a sense of the numbers that we're talking about here, and some outcomes that you've seen in the financial lives of people who maybe pulled themselves out of poverty as a result.
So we've got about 500,000 individual transactions now in our system, and that's just through our actual Insight products that we've developed. But then in addition to that, through the other data sources, we've brought in about 2.5 million other financial records. And so I guess together what we've seen is we've been able to provide access to capital to about 40% of our Insight users. And then in addition to that, just through actually using the product itself, we've seen an average increase in savings of about 6%. So we actually see that people change their spending habits as a result of actually knowing more about their money. And then specifically around micro entrepreneurs or small business owners actually using the product, we've seen an increase in income of those individuals of about 30%.
That's great. Camilo, I was reading one of your blogs, so I'm just going to rip it off right here. Brazil has something like, 260 million mobile connections,
Right.
Making it the largest in Latin America, and I think the fourth largest
in the world.
And so in that mix, you've got e-money providers, you've got network operators, you've got digital wallet types, you've got card companies, and of course you've got the banks. So give us some sense of how these regulatory players are playing nice or not playing nice. What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, well, Brazil is also specific. But, Brazil always dances to its own beat.
Okay.
It's very different than the rest of Latin America. So from a regulatory perspective, actually, the development of mobile money in Latin America anyways has been trailing behind Africa and South Asia, partly because the banks had such strong foundations in the region. When it comes to Brazil, actually, kind of like only this year, the mobile payments law came into effect. What's good about it is that it's going to allow for a quite kind of like diverse group of players to actually, offer services and, be in different parts of the value chain. So what we're starting to see is basically now all the big mobile operators are actually going into partnerships with banks, which is very different than what we saw in Africa, where operators were basically launching by themselves. And it's something that I think kind of like we've seen in most places in Latin America. Only in the smaller countries have the operators been able to actually go out and provide the services themselves. Which in a way, maybe it's not as good because it doesn't leave as much room for, say, startups or smaller companies to actually, have a bigger share of the pie. But at the same time, the services that are going out in the market are going to be much more complex because at the end of the day, just the financial ecosystem is much more developed. So the needs of the customers and what's going to drive usage is going to definitely require more investment.
Elena, you mentioned a few examples, some sterling examples of your investments. 7, I believe, you've invested so far in 7 companies from the fund. Give us a sense of trends and what's interesting investors right now. Are you looking for companies that already have 2 or 3 plays down the line in terms of partnerships or in terms of leveraging networks?
Well, we are at Axion Venture Lab. It's somewhat unique because we usually go where other investors don't dare to go, and we take more risks than others, partly because we are housed and funded by Axion International, which is an NGO that's very mission-focused. And so we engage with companies at much earlier stages in the process. It's not quite at the idea or business plan stage, but they can be pre-revenue. And usually we're the first types of kind of institutional capital that comes in after the family and friends and fools. So to really help support these ideas as they grow over time. What we found is that even though the examples that I mentioned are a lot about using data, different types of data for improving access to credit, it's actually quite hard sometimes to get that data, especially in emerging markets where we're focusing. And so we'll get into the challenges of big data probably next. But for example, when you're trying to get data from a mobile network operator, just because initially they say that they may be interested in selling it to you, it can take years, in fact, to get that contract signed and to really get data that they aren't using themselves, but that they technically own. And so there are challenges with actually generating that data, with then being able to secure access to it, and then analyze it in ways that someone is willing to pay for it. So also as a fund, we're looking for, and maybe we haven't discussed this quite yet, there are cool ways to use data that's already available, but in order for a business to be sustainable and scalable, it needs to have financial returns for the business, for its investors. And so are there enough players in the space who are willing to pay sufficient amount of money for the lessons that can be learned from that data? And that's a challenge for many companies as well.
Yeah, I imagine. So the one more time, the hashtag for questions is SEConf Big Data. So I want to get into some of those challenges now, and the one that steps out to me most is just access to electricity. I mean, access to power. So basically everywhere on Earth, with the exception of Africa, is seeing a decrease in the people without power. According to the International Energy Agency, by 2020, in the next 20 years, Africa will reach 700 million people without power. And off-grid solar is obviously growing, but it's not growing that much. So how does that pull the brakes on what some of the activities are happening specifically in Africa? Camilo, maybe you could speak to that. It's how do you overcome that basic fundamental challenge?
Sure. Well, one of the things we're starting to see, over the last couple of months, we've been doing a very close mapping in some countries in East Africa, especially the ones that have had already kind of like quite large uptake of mobile money, to see could that be a fertile environment basically for startups to plug into these payments platforms and then use them perhaps actually for financing either solar home kits or even bigger projects like solar farms? How would this work out? And there's already kind of like a bunch of companies that are starting to do this, not just in East Africa, but also in India. I see Simpa here, actually. There is obviously a big opportunity there. The question is, how does it work in terms of the business model, right? For a startup, basically, do you have to, you embed a SIM card in a solar home kit, it's quite expensive, right? And the margins are really low. So, could you develop other types of technologies that actually bypass mobile operators that are able to, perhaps mediate these payments, but are, going around it? And other startups are already starting to do that, right? There's a company called Angaza, which is doing work in Tanzania and in Kenya. So it is starting to happen, but it's very early on.
Shivani, do you have some thoughts on that? I know maybe you might not be. Is InVenture in Africa, or okay? How are you dealing with that kind of a challenge?
Sure. We are actually in Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa, and we are actually working on a pilot with Angaza. And so it's pretty interesting for us because I think we think of it almost as an ecosystem approach where Angaza has the challenge of high defaults because they can't actually do a screen in terms of who they're actually looking for in terms of customers who can afford their products, but who can actually continue to make the payments. And so we'll actually do all the scoring for them, but then we get all the access to the payment information. So it actually helps us in validating the cash flow data that we bring in.
Do you want to add to that, Elaine?
And actually, just before joining Axion Venture Lab, I spent about a year working for one of the startups in this space, also doing pay-as-you-go systems for slightly more robust technologies, solar microgrids in Africa. And something that we found that could be valuable down the line is the ability to track usage and across different households. And so the data that you can get with smart technologies can be used for making the system more reliable, for providing a quality of service kind of that's more automatic and therefore more cost efficient, but also at least we were theorizing of how electric suppliers of electric products may be interested in knowing exactly the usage patterns to know which communities out there in the world that are just entering this market and that never had power before beyond kerosene would be good customers for their products. And so it's a win-win situation that the startup can try to leverage.
So pay-as-you-go for those, that you define that as sort of metering based on usage, and as long as you're paying, you're getting
Exactly.
provided
It's
power.
a similar concept to top-ups and mobile payments, but topping up on electricity, which also Simpa is working on, and others.
Right. Keith, did you want to
No,
take that one too?
we're blessed in the sense of that really doesn't affect our business, but the amount of cell phone users in India is so robust. And even in Africa, traveling to remote parts of Africa, I'm always amazed at the amount of cell phone users and their ability to utilize this SMS-based platform, which was, in essence, created just for that reason, to expand the scope and touch into those more rural areas in both India and Africa so we can extract that data.
Yeah, and the other challenge that I see a lot of is the network collaboration, network cooperation. If you're a mobile operator and you have something like 40% market share in a country that has 50% mobile penetration or less, I mean that's basically going to get you about 10% of the population. That's not my numbers. That's from Ignacio Mas, one of our writers, who's a mobile money consultant. But it's not terribly useful. So you're getting these islands of networks. It seems to me that, and I'm just curious about what each of you are seeing. Is there more cooperation now as they start to scale up and see the advantages to this, or let's go back in reverse order, Keith?
Yeah, no, that's one of our biggest challenges in India, dealing with Airtel and the larger providers. When we go to them and say we're providing information to 600 or verifying 600 million unit doses, and therefore we're looking to buy packages in $50 to $100 million, 50 to 100 million text message blocks, they look at us like, okay, but we can't even get them on the phone. So those numbers are so small to them. We face that challenge of trying to buy data, trying to buy access. We also utilize messages, incentivize people to give them free types of text message or free minutes on phone. So we're negotiating with them constantly, and that's our biggest struggle, is having enough bandwidth you'd think with 700 million people, but we really don't even hit their radar as it relates to the amount of messages that they're sending and receiving. And Nigeria is the same way. The amount of data that flows through those providers is so robust. It's for us negotiating with them is we don't negotiate. We just kind of take what they give back to us at this point. It's getting a little bit better, and we do have leverage from a political standpoint of the government mandates in Nigeria, so we'll try to buy data under that guise. In India, it's the same way. We do have a really nice story from a social platform and the amount of people that we're helping, but we still have challenges in negotiating and buying access to the time and minutes and things like that.
What do you think the market could be if you didn't have those sorts of restrictions? Would it kind of be limitless, or what?
Yeah, it would probably be a 2 to 3x type of situation where we could have that kind of impact. And more or less, we kind of play two sides of the fence. When we're trying to buy stuff from people, we play our social card story and gosh, we're doing great for humanity and things like that. And then when I'm selling something to it, we're trying to sell a commodity and this amount of data, and then I'm trying to commercialize it. So, and a lot of times I'm wearing two hats. In the negotiation side, I'm the poor guy that has, just trying to beg for minutes to help a social cause, and then we turn around and try to extract that data out. So.
Well done.
We're trying to play both sides of the fence. So we have to find a way to commoditize this, and really that's the essence of the argument. The company was started with this great social, gosh, this story is so amazing. We've got the company so far. Now what do? We have all this data. Who cares? How can I get an investor to invest more money in a company that is verifying medicines, but nobody really cares beyond that? We have to extract data. We've got to engage patients. You've got to do that type of thing to really create a valuation of the company that makes it viable to an investor. Otherwise, you're just receiving, you're more or less a recipient of SMS messages, and we're trying to make that inflection point and move forward.
Scott, can we ask?
Yeah, you don't have to be on Twitter to ask questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. No, it's directly related to your point about the data. So what type of data do you have? You know what pharmaceutical products people are buying, so therefore you know what diseases. Do they have diabetes? Are they treating malaria, etc.? So who would that be useful for? I'm only thinking because I'm aware of the Sproxil model, where the farmers, pharmaceutical companies, are tied in. But furthermore, Scott mentioned MAMA. You've got that program in Nokia Life Tools. There's a lot of programs now that send health information, and Damani in India, the healthcare workers. So can't you have some kind of a marriage, or is that what you're pursuing?
Well, yeah, so that was my job. That's why I came into the company. My background is in pharma. In the U.S., pharma companies buy every piece of data that relates to you as a consumer that you know about and don't know about. That's what the model that we're bringing. We've started a program with Dr. Reddy's in India for a biologic product called CRESP, which is a post-transplant product that patients utilize. What we found is what we really need to get to is engaging those patients in more chronic type diseases and products that really, to be frank, have a higher dollar value. Nobody cares about a generic medicine that's pennies on the dollar, and you can have the most robust data set, nobody wants to see it. What we found is now we can engage and utilize this mobile platform to extract more in-depth data. We're getting down to patients' hemoglobin levels. We're getting down to all different types of basic demographic, cell phone number, age, all the commons type stuff. But since we made a turn to the more clinical applications of the product, that's when our evaluation and things like that. And we've done this now for 2,000 patients with this product, and we have upwards of about 87% of the people we retain and engage them on an ongoing basis, and that's where the value of the data is. So it's getting beyond what you're saying. It's getting beyond just receiving an SMS message back. We're providing health tips. The content of the data is becoming more valuable to the patient/consumer, and then our ability to engage them going forward is more viable. But we've got to be in the moment with the patient. The only value in data is the closer I can get to the patient to a positive outcome, i.e. I had a transplant, I'm doing well, I'm concerned about survival, and I'm receiving a text message back from that patient saying, wow, my hemoglobin level is really good, I'm really happy about that. Our ability as a company to be in that moment with the patient is really what the value is for us. How can we quickly, and we redirect patients, another part of our platform is directing towards doctors. If my hemoglobin level is bad, we immediately ping them back a message, linking them with 11,000 physicians in India to go immediate get care. So what I've tried to do to create value here is create richer data that plays in a level of space that no other providers can get to utilizing a mobile platform.
All right, I'm going to go to some Twitter questions now. So this one is for Shivani. What are the challenges of standardizing data collection formats when using such diverse sources?
working in all these different countries, how are we actually standardizing it? Is that a good gauge of it? Whoever's question that
Whoever
was.
asked that question, is that what you meant?
Okay. So I think to answer that question, what we do is, I think a lot of the information we bring in, we've got about 33 different demographic variables that we bring into the algorithm. And those things I think can be standardized. So we're looking at things like household size, we look at household assets, we look at industry types, we look at district level information, access to formal electricity, the gender of the individual. And so these are things that it's true, I mean, it's going to vary by country, but we do have a lot of baseline data that we compare each of those variables against, which allows us to kind of apply different weights to each of the assumptions in the algorithm. I think the other thing that we've done a really good job of, and we're definitely still building it, is actually building profiles of different users. So we've gotten to a point now, especially in areas where we're concentrated, like Chennai, where we can say, we understand, the tile maker who has 4 kids in this particular district in Chennai versus a tile maker who has 2 kids. And so we can actually say, okay, now based on the expenses that this person's reporting, are they actually valid or not? And so it allows us to kind of, start to say, okay, we don't need to have all 33 variables at every time. As long as we have like tier 1 variables, we're okay. And so that's kind of how we can think of when we go to the next country, we start with those 6 variables and then work up to 33 variables.
Here's a question for you, Elena, for the Venture Lab folks. How do companies like Demist access their data sets? Is it through telco partnerships, governments, social web sources? What is the cost of access, and is that a barrier for them?
So Demist in particular, it started by focusing on developed markets, and all the data they use comes from public sources. So you can think of it as a very sophisticated Google search that can be done rather than in several hours on a particular person with all the data that may have been provided, kind of their address, their employment status, but done in the course of kind of less than a minute. And so there is a lot of public information out there that can be analyzed in smart ways. And it's more true for developed markets than emerging markets. But already there's, I think the statistics is 4.1 million gigabytes of data per person. And over time, that has been about 1/3 of that data was coming from emerging markets. Now it's 2/3. So it's surprising, actually, the numbers, and Camilo mentioned Brazil, but throughout the developing world, the numbers of people that are participating in online sites that have email, that have other information. But that information can only get you so far. So that's a particular example of Demist, but as I mentioned, any other sources, whether it's getting data from mobile network operators or consumer goods companies, those partnerships can be quite tricky and very much depend on the market dynamics and what the competitive relationships are. Kind of, will you be eaten up by that gorilla that you're trying to negotiate with, and all the challenges that come with that.
When you talk about data of that volume, I'm thinking of the national ID project that's happening in India, the Aadhaar program. And that's a unique, people are signing up to get a unique 12-digit code, I believe it is, and it captures biometric data like their fingerprints. And the Indian government has set a target of 600 million people in the database by 2014. And maybe it's just every story that comes out these days about the NSA and how much data we have. I'm starting to wonder if there might be a little bit of a pushback on some of these things, good intentioned as they are, and the privacy concerns that are out there. And that's got to be an element, especially with medical. How are you managing that? Obviously, people sign up for the system. They know what they're doing, or do they? Do they know that the data is going that deeply?
Yeah, that's really one of our biggest constraints from a legality standpoint is how can we pass personal health information back and forth through a mobile platform. What we're asking patients to do is an opt-in service in most cases, so they're the person that's initiating the contact with us, therefore gives us a little bit of latitude. In India, it's a little bit more leeway as to what we can do from a legality standpoint, but it's the essence of our business. How can we make sure that we're passing this data in a secure manner, that we harvest it and hold it in a secure manner with HIPAA-compliant servers and things like that, but it's a huge challenge for us. And that's something that really, as we transition our business to the U.S., will become more and more of a concern for us, and certainly not going to go anywhere.
And Camilo, I think I just read the other day that in the Times of India that new regulations are going to require ATMs and credit card swipes to have a mechanism for authenticating biometrics, presumably fingerprint technology. Is that where we're going with all of this? And
Yeah, I mean, we've seen different biometric efforts when it comes to access to financial services in countries like Pakistan. Initially, when they were launching branchless banking, the government actually required this to happen, but that actually hampered the development of the whole industry. So, I mean, I don't know. I guess to a certain degree, maybe that's where things are heading. When it comes to financial inclusion, especially in terms of access to the VOP, I think the lower the requirements that exist, the better. People don't understand necessarily, what are these cards, how their data is being used. In a way, you're dealing with the most vulnerable part of society. So I think it's really important in all the companies that are doing this type of work. There's no regulation in a lot of countries for data privacy. I know, for example, like in Mexico, the user is owner of the data, and the operator or the banks are just data custodians. But at the end of the day, the users themselves are the ones who actually, control the usage of this data. But over a phone platform, how do you actually agree? How do you understand what kind of contract you're getting into? And when you're dealing with people who sometimes are illiterate, when I buy things on iTunes, I accept just the terms of reference. I never read that.
Don't we
Now,
all?
when it comes to medical records, and someone who has low levels of education, what happens then? I mean, it's important ethical questions that I think none of us are still, we don't understand them yet.
Yeah. And I want to stick with you on that, and we can come around again on the regulatory front. We've had conversations on Next Billion, and we've had blog posts and even sometimes debates about, who's the mobile operator and who's the bank. There are a lot of discussions around, well, there aren't regulations for these mobile operators the way that the bricks and mortar banks have had to deal with. And Camila, you and I were talking about that a little bit. And is that changing? I mean, you talked about the bill in Brazil that just passed. And do you see some hope for at least fruitful collaboration, productive collaboration, so ultimately more people can be part of the formal financial system?
Definitely. I think, in a way, sort of people have when they're starting to realize that people are not necessarily using the services the way that they expected them to. The strategy has been shifting to more kind of like building a market and building an ecosystem. At the end of the day, everyone wants to make money, right? But you're only going to make money if there's network effects and people are on different platforms, different services are being provided. So there's definitely more partnerships that are coming into place. Some of them actually are being dictated by regulation within the specific countries. There are issues, I think, for example, like in Kenya, for branchless banking, so like the use of agents by banks is regulated by the government, and mobile money agents, so for example, M-Pesa, that was not really regulated. So for example, capital requirements come into effect. All these different issues that make it less competitive for other providers. So there, and this is very country specific. So there are issues still there, but I think kind of the partnerships that are coming into effect now, and in the future will probably kind of lead to better and more innovative developments.
Thoughts on that?
And on the regulatory side, it's not just the regulators themselves, but also the other parts of the government that can play a role in incentivizing mobile payments. So, for example, right now there is an initiative underway in Chile where I believe 95% or 98% of government social payments are paid in cash right now. And they're thinking of moving that to prepaid cards / mobile wallets. So if the government can really single-handedly simulate, I think, a tenth at least of the country receiving mobile money in their mobile wallets, that can create an ecosystem where all of a sudden the merchants are incentivized to accept mobile payments, the mobile network operators want to play along, the banks want to own those bank accounts that will be created and issue those cards and take transaction fees. So the government can play a large role in incentivizing an ecosystem, even outside of the regulatory perspective.
Yeah.
The one thing I'll say that what we've seen from an information standpoint, and in a lot of cases, what we found in collecting our data sets as it relates to straight regulatory concerns is patients' quest for information, and in our case, health tips and things like that, way outpaces the regulatory concerns. So what we see is patients in our post-transplant patients that they are so hungry to get successful health tip messages to really drive their own personal health care. Their caregivers are concerned about them. So what we see in these subsets of patients that we deal with that are really, really sick, their quest and wanting information pushed to them and sent back to us far outpaces any regulatory concern. They're not concerned about regulatory. They want to get access to their physician. They want to put out as much information about them personally as they can to get feedback on how to get better. So we see that in a lot of cases way outpacing the regulatory concern, almost that we're going 2 or 3 steps back when we deal with regulatory, saying, well, wait a second, our patients are so far ahead of that, they're willing to opt into these type of programs, so let's kind of raise the bar from a regulatory standpoint that matches either how sick patients are or in some way, really meets their quest for more information, because they're willing to give it, but let's not constrain them from a regulatory concern where it burdens us as a company so we can't provide the access to the information that they want.
I think this is a question for everyone on the panel, which is the old impact question. What frameworks do you use to translate your data into qualitative impact? In other words, are you doing what you set out to do? Let's start with Shivani on that one. You mentioned it already with the sets that you provide, but is that a moving target for you as far as your impact, and how do you keep up with it?
Yeah, I mean, we also use the Grameen PPI, so we use the Progress Out of Poverty Index. So we do ask, the general 10 basic questions around kind of quality of life and whether individuals are accessing other, health services, education services, are they making home improvements? We don't necessarily, in a sense, directly affect the customer anymore, so we're not providing the actual financing, not providing the actual healthcare services, but what we can show is that as a result of now using Insight or gaining access to finance, this is what's actually happened in the daily life of this individual afterwards. So in a sense, what we do is we actually measure our impact by the other service providers. And so we help other service providers actually gauge their impact on the quality of life of individuals.
Alina, how do you take that in consideration when you're thinking about investing in a company or evaluating a company? What impact screens are you using?
Sure, and there are maybe somewhat more obvious direct impacts and social impacts that a company can produce. But as a fund that focuses on very early stage companies, if you compare, let's say, companies has a very innovative model of providing health financing that's very pioneering for a particular country. If you just calculate the number of loans that they extend in their first year of pilot to patients, it's not going to be very much, relatively speaking. But they may be setting the trend for something much bigger, both in that country and across the world. So a question for us is how to not only measure direct social impact of our companies that we oftentimes set out to do kind of in the process of due diligence and understanding what the final outcomes we're trying to achieve, but also how to, and I don't think anyone in this space has quite figured this out yet, how to measure demonstration effects, how to measure that catalytic impact that everyone talks about through stories, but are there ways to quantify the fact that this particular company has now spurred a movement, or maybe even if the company itself has failed, we have learned something and disseminated knowledge that has helped many others follow in its footsteps. So it's more a question to you guys.
Do you have an answer for that too? Is what you're tracking? What's the most important impact measurement? If it's iris or gears or those sorts of things, or a little bit more even finite for the companies that are dealing in mobile and big data.
Yeah, I mean, kind of, when it comes to, we haven't actually done any specific projects within CGAP that we have funded basically companies. We've done some demonstration pilots, specifically actually with a company that was doing CDR, using CDR data for credit scoring. So a bit similar to what you guys were doing. We're trying to figure out first, does it work? We do see that it works, but we haven't actually, put any money in any of the companies. So it's, basically we don't really have any impact data at the moment.
You have impact, not impact data.
I guess we could go to the audience too. I think if we just don't have to take Twitter questions. Does anyone have a question that maybe did appear on Twitter or they want to ask? Sure, go ahead.
Bruce, do you guys use or have any examples that you know of that, or what sort of of like media, what kind of data can you work with? Like, are we doing just text at this point? Video, sound? What's the scope? And what's the approach to getting to the most challenging types?
Yep. For us, it's mainly just a mobile platform that we can utilize at this point. Receive SMS messages, smartphone applications, sending and receiving 2D barcodes. We don't do any video at this point. The closest that we get to that really is in some of our more advanced programs, in some way trying to get patients and physicians to communicate, but it's all on the same platform. We're not using any video or audio and things like that.
And related to that, there was a question earlier that I think is interesting. Is can you actually ID hotspots for counterfeit medications? Are you seeing a heat map of the data and
Right. Yeah. That was another. Once we started receiving this data, and in the beginning form of the company was just that. This medicine was produced by this manufacturer, and yes, on this date, you're fine, take the medicine, go ahead. What we started then to do is, okay, well, what other inferences can we make from getting that data? So now we can create full-on Tableau type of screenshots that also look at the supply chain. So as this medicine is manufactured on this supply chain, our code is put on it. We can track it through the supply chain in all at different areas of India and Africa. We can see how long product sits in the supply chain based upon the same code that we're putting on packages. So we can go back now to manufacturers when we're trying to, I'm taking off my social do-better hat and trying to put a valuation on the company and drive sales and say, this is how long things are sitting in the supply chain. This is where your trouble spots are. And then from a straight counterfeiting standpoint, this is where we see the most amount of fake quote-unquote authentications or verifications coming in, and try to figure out a way and strategy to help them deal with both of those issues.
other data sets that anyone on the panel or companies that are in your purview are pulling in?
For mobile money, one of the things that we're starting to see is operators in some places, for example, would extend loans for top-ups if people run out of money. This is mostly people who have prepaid accounts. But now as time is going by, they're actually starting to use that airtime top-up history to extend short-term loans to them. So there's the first product like this called M-Shwari. It's in Kenya, and it's in partnership with a bank. And it's seen huge uptick. It runs on the M-Pesa platform, so people can move their money onto a savings account, which is an interest-bearing savings account. And then from there, based on that transaction history, actually how much they're saving, if it's little amounts, they can ask for 30-day loans. So this is obviously kind of really, really interesting data that they're starting to use, and we're starting to see that being done by other operators in other markets.
One interesting type of data that we've seen is for online lending providers. So whether it's peer-to-peer lenders or online savings groups that can monitor online transactions. Something you can look at is, for example, how the customer interacts with your website. How much time do they spend on the FAQ? Do they just read the question about what happens when I don't repay? So there are different metrics that can now be developed once you bring the customer. So analyzing the behaviors can itself inform, and kind of as you put that into your statistical algorithms, can inform the quality of the credit that you may be able to extend.
And that goes to educating the consumer to the extent that literacy is a factor, and probably rewriting something that's less clear. If people are hovering on it for a long time, then you probably have a problem. I have to ask this question because it's a Twitter question. Do any of the panelists find Twitter data to be a helpful or relevant data source? Throwing it out there.
We're starting to see, there's a couple of models. There's a company called Lendo, I believe, which is in Colombia and in the Philippines, and they're actually using social network data, doing social network analysis for loans as well. So they tend to not necessarily focus on the BOP. I think it's mostly people sort of kind of like lower middle income, perhaps students that need educational loans. So they just analyze basically their social network. In a way, sort of follows to a certain degree, sort of kind of like old group lending methodology, and the pressure of sort of kind of your peer groups. If you ask for a loan, then you're probably less likely to default on it. But it's new, so there's still no demonstration effects.
So it's looking at Lendo is looking at your social network. It's almost like your little community of character witnesses, which I guess depending on whether you get into arguments on Facebook, that can be a good or bad thing. Any other social media data that's proving useful for you, Giovanni?
So we use a lot of predictive analysis kind of stuff. So asking people, we sprinkle in questions around, who do you think is going to win the cricket match today? Or in India around the elections, we ask a lot of questions around that. It all goes back, I think, to behavior questions, right? So trying to find out how involved is this person actually in reading the news? How involved are they in actually providing us with information? So a more engaged user to us is actually somebody who's going to have a better score. We do something similar in terms of actually creating a social network. So what we do is we've got reference codes, so you can actually get people to opt into the product. And then, the more people that are actually in your trust network, we see that as, okay, you've got actually a huge loyal community of people that we could go to and ask them whether or not you're a good individual. If we were to if we were to randomly audit you, and we found out that you were fraudulent or somebody within your trust network was fraudulent, it would actually make both of your scores go down. So there's an incentive to kind of increase the number of people in your group and then actually de-incentivize you to not be fraudulent. I think things that are really interesting that we've brought in are really categories of expenses, as well as categories of savings. So we find out, people in Kenya, they might be actually saving for a cow versus a two-wheeler or saving for their kids' education. Just based on even what they decide to be saving for, I think really correlates to their repayment abilities. So that's been really interesting. I think fuel expenses, health expenses, we're able to really think about in the same way heat graphs and thinking about, okay, if there's a person that's spending a lot of money on health, and you can see that a lot of in that area, all the artisans in that community are also doing it, it's potentially showing us that there might be, a reason for us to send a health NGO into that area. So that's some of the stuff we're looking at too.
That's really fascinating. And that goes back to community building too. If you know my neighbor's having this problem, I'm having this problem, hey, maybe we need to get together on a solution. Do you see the data over time becoming more accessible to the customers to know what to know the spread of disease, for instance, to know what's happening in my particular community based on what I'm sending to you, PharmaSecure?
Yeah, we do, and we utilize it. The biggest problem for us is once we print this label on the code, there's nothing that mandates this person who receives it to authenticate the medicine. So we utilize the social platforms to educate our group of 11,000 physicians that this program is going on. It's on the back of medicines, so it drives for us verifications and authentications as well. So that's really the way that we're utilizing this and trying to, again, start that process where we can then start to extract data and engage patients on an ongoing basis to let them know in specific regions, as we do in the supply chain, that yes, these issues of whatever the health issue that we're trying to address are of concern, prevalence, adherence, and compliance to medicine, all that stuff kind of goes into the same ball to educate them.
Camila, do you see this being more transparent data over time and not just the, for good domain, but it's still the domain of NGOs and companies? Do you see this getting out there more to the people as they move from standard phones maybe to smartphones, as that proliferation continues?
I was just going to mention that. I mean, I think as the rates of penetration for smartphones increase, then there'll be better ways actually then to have a two-way communication between the providers and actually connect the users. At the moment, I mean, it's hard over SMS to actually provide a user-friendly platform to be able to do this. But I think as we see an increase in the use of apps and smartphones amongst the BOP, I think probably we'll see more of this.
More question? I saw that hand go up right there. Yes, ma'am.
I want to take a step back and ask kind of a macro question. As we move towards the post-2015 Millennium Goals or Sustainable Development Goals, whatever they're going to be called, I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about the importance of the private sector being involved in that, and the fact that there's a lot of hesitance on the part of the private sector to be engaged in social innovation or CSR or however they want to look at it, because they say they have a lack of data. And so I'm hearing they need to be involved and invest. There are data, apparently. There's what everybody here is talking about, and yet there's clearly a disconnect. Public-private partnerships are the way of the future, but there's obviously a disconnect between the implementers on the ground, the social enterprises who are nimble enough to get the data, and the organizations that have other kinds of resources to bring to bear. So does anybody have any thoughts about how to connect that, how to bridge that gap and make those connections?
We're we worked on a partnership with, there's a company in India called Mahindra. They're one of the largest kind of multinational companies there. And they were actually building a set of affordable houses, right? So they said, okay, there's a huge market, a huge demand for housing in India, right? And they said that they were really building it at the price point of, that an actual low income to, let's say, actually a low income customer could afford it. But the problem that Mahindra had was they don't actually know how to be able to find these individuals that can afford their homes. So they came to us and they said, okay, you guys actually say you have the data. Can you act as a lead generator or actually demand aggregator to tell us who our customers are, where are they, how much can they afford? And so what we did was we worked with the local NGOs and self-help groups, aggregated the demand, understood what the price point was, and actually supplied that information to Mahindra. And so when they opened their sales office, what they did was they actually left open 200 homes in this 2,000 unit development just specifically for Insight users, saying, okay, we've actually validated it. These are individuals who we've now pre-screened for mortgages. And so they were actually able to get first entry into this new development. But I think it's really interesting because it was successful that now when Mahindra's looking at their next 4 sites, they're actually saying, let's do the same kind of work that we did there, which is actually using NGOs, but then layering data on top of that to connect them.
It's a great example. Let's get any more other questions? Right here, in the blue.
In the U.S., traditional lenders are required to think carefully about disparate impact that their lending practices may have on certain groups, and that's obviously for very specific historical reasons. But I was wondering if you all have come across either regulations in the countries where you work, or even outside of the regulatory environment, if you think about how these products and these data are feeding into products and loans that might have disparate impact on different groups, and how you deal with that from a business perspective and ethically.
Who would like to tackle that one? Camilo, that's right. Or Elena.
Sure. Well, I mean, I haven't seen anything specific to the groups, but I can see, just in terms of sort of financial products, not necessarily on credit, but something that happened recently, which actually raises some of these issues. In Zimbabwe, actually, Econet, which is one of the big mobile operators there, had a partnership with I think Namibian insurance company called Trustco. And through this partnership, mobile insurance is one of the new financial products that is actually starting to get scale. Over 1 million people had gotten their insurance, and again, you're dealing with basically the poorest segment of society. There was a lawsuit because of some corporate issues. Basically, the partnership was dissolved, and overnight, 1 million people lost their insurance. So, in a way, and there was no regulation in place for this. There was no regulation actually that allowed the MNO to provide insurance, or what kind of partnership was set up in place. So, it's an issue, right? And for credit, I imagine it's going to be the same thing, especially also coming out of the microfinance crisis in India specifically.
It's definitely a matter of the business, the private sector driving the regulatory sector, and you don't know what to regulate because the products are so new. So other questions? One more question. Okay. On this side of the room, anyone? Before I move on, I'm kind of geared this way. Another question? Yes. Final question.
Speak to any unique challenges that come with mobile data relating to sort of data quality. Are you concerned about representativeness when you're looking at a population scope? And are there any controls you can put in place, or are there ways that you can change your interpretation of those data sets?
I think one of the questions that we raise sometimes is the validity of the data. And it's mobile or otherwise, especially when it's self-reported, which is usually the case whether you're gathering data from SMEs or from directly from borrowers. And as they learn, maybe initially they're open to providing that data, but people are smart, and as they understand the uses of it, how do you verify it, and how do you make sure that it's reliable? So that's one of the concerns that we have about the types of data that we can gather, and where the incentives are.
Yeah, the validity of data for us is really the key to our success is, and we face the challenges of, as you said, is self-reported data on an SMS-based system to where, what is the real quality? We'll usually, the first time we send patients text messages back. It's usually a set of about 5 messages that they can answer pretty quickly. And then once we have them engaged, we can get into more in-depth type of message that we can start to ask them qualifying questions that we can tell what type of user they are. Are they really engaged? Or are they just trying to get us off the screen type of thing? So, but to be able to scale data and then make inferences about health outcomes, you've got to keep digging and digging on these patients to start sending them more and more in-depth messages that get have a more clinical aspect that we can tell how they're doing, but not overwhelm them in a sense of, I feel like it's a really fine line for us that's way too much and I don't want to participate. So that's our biggest challenge.
Well, we're at time here, but this has been a great conversation. Thank you all, and I'd like everyone to thank the panel and yourselves for some great questions. Thank you very much.